Chapter 3. Playing Tag in Allah's Palace. By this time, Somalia and Ethiopia were engaged in a crippling conflict. The war to come would kill thousands of citizens in both countries, ripping out the thin roots of two economic systems that had only just started to function. No travel between Mogadishu and Addis Ababa was permitted. It was obvious that my parents would have to meet somewhere else if they were going to see each other again. Somali Airways didn't fly to very many places. One of them was Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia. Sending each other messages through the clan network, my parents agreed to meet there. The clan also produced a fake passport for my mother. She claimed to be an ordinary Dul Bahante woman on a pilgrimage to Mecca. I like to imagine them, my father, my mother, young and happy, meeting in Jeddah, yearning to live once more as one family. My mother didn't want to move to Ethiopia because Ethiopians were Christians, unbelievers. Saudi Arabia was God's country, the homeland of the Prophet Muhammad. A truly Muslim country, it was resident with Allah, the most suitable place to bring up children. My mother had learned Arabic in Aden. More important, she had also imbibed a vision that Islam was purer, deeper, closer to God than the countries of the Arabian Peninsula. Saudi Arabian law came straight from the Quran. It was the law of Allah. Inevitably, the life of our family reunited in Saudi Arabia would be predictable, certain, and good. Somehow, she convinced our father of this plan. He found a job in Saudi Arabia at one of the government ministries. I remember his job as deciphering Morse code for some government service. He moved to Riyadh and lived at a clanmate's house while he waited for the preparations for our flight to be completed. My mother was heroic. Yet she managed to get another false passport, which the names and dates of birth of her 3 children were listed so we could leave Somalia with her. She packed in secret. She arranged for us to be driven discreetly to the airport. One morning, in April 1978, I was 8 years old. Grandmother woke us up early, the gray light barely beginning to filter into the room. She dressed us in good dresses instead of school uniforms. Khadijah's oldest stepson, who owned a garage opposite our house, arrived in his black car and bundled us in rapidly. Grandma stayed home. We spilled out of the car, miles later. Ma pointed to a huge metal tube with flat wings poking out of it that was standing nearby. "That is an airplane," she announced. "We're going to fly on it." We had never seen an airplane close up before, just the far-off machines that celebrated Afwain's rule by belching smoke across the city once a year on a national holiday. We shrieked and raced about, flapping our arms. The prospect of flying was so exciting. We imagined she might even mean we would fly like birds. With the fake passport and the grueling interrogation by airport officials ahead of her, my mother didn't need the extra trouble. She swung her hard, flat hand at our heads and cuffed us into silence. We couldn't stay for long. We couldn't stay good for long. We kids had almost never gone anywhere. We were never taken out on excursions. And here, at long last, was an utterly thrilling adventure. Herded into the aircraft, we wriggled out of our seat belts and fought for the window seat, biting and scratching and climbing over total strangers. As the plane rose into the sky, my mother glared at us. "Let this plane crash, Allah," she called out. "Take them away. I don't want this life. Let us all die." This was worse than being hit, the worst thing I had ever heard. Our ears throbbed from the altitude and we screamed the entire flight. We were hated by every person on that plane. Then, just before we landed, along with all other women passengers on the airplane, our mother covered herself with a huge black cloth, showing only her face. That silenced us. We followed her into the airport terminal in Jeddah, where Amid a completely astounding number of people with all kinds of garments and skin colors, Ma discovered that our father had not come to pick us up. We were completely on our own, abandoned in the airport in Jeddah. I'm not quite sure if this is exactly true, but this is my understanding of what happened. My father was expecting us to arrive, though he may not have known the precise date. Then, a sudden call came for him from Addis Ababa. The day we left Somalia, there was an attempted coup against Afwain. Somalia's airspace was closed, and there was fighting. After the coup, leaders were executed. There was a period of much more intense surveillance. If we hadn't left when we did, who knows when we would have been able to get out. For reasons that cannot be unrelated to the attempted coup, my father rushed back to Ethiopia. In his haste, he must have neglected to arrange for someone to meet the next Somali Airways flight to Jeddah, the flight that we had managed to get on. Again and again, in years to come, Ma flung this scene at my father in accusation. For now, we were well and truly stuck. This was Saudi Arabia, where Islam originated, governed strictly according to the scriptures and an example of the Prophet Muhammad. And by law, all women in Saudi Arabia must be in the care of a man. My mother argued loudly with the Saudi immigration official, but he merely repeated in an ever louder voice that she could not leave the airport without a man in charge. He never looked straight at her, only somewhere just above her head. We spent hours in that strange airport. We played tag. Mahad got lost. I vomited. Ma said the devil was in us and cursed us to hell and back. She looked different, drained. She didn't seem to have anything under control. She cried and said unkind things about father, things I had never heard her say. My mother must have felt betrayed. She had been so competent, managing the clandestine departure, the false passports, and now she was abandoned. Just before nightfall, the Somali man came up and asked my mother what was the matter. He was a Dobante, like her, so he offered to help. My mother just asked him to take her to Jeddah, to the home of a Dobahante family she knew of, where we could stay. All she needed was his help through the immigration desk and into the taxi. Without a man in charge, no taxi driver would accept her in his car. We woke up in the house of this unknown family in Jeddah. The bedroom was small and intensely hot. My mother was fierce. We must behave. That meant staying in the room, on the bed. If we talked louder than a whisper, we were hit, and if we walked around, we were hit too. We looked out of the window into the big courtyard where half a dozen Somali women of all ages were cooking and talking. One of them, a young woman, offered to take us for a walk. Outdoors was a completely different world. The roads were paved, the traffic was astounding, and all the women in this country were covered in black. They were human-like shapes. The front of them was black, and the back of them was black too. You could see which way they were looking only by the direction their shoes pointed. We could tell they were women because the lady who was holding our hands tightly to prevent us from wandering off was covered in black too. You could see her face because she was Somali. Saudi women had no faces. We pulled away and ran over to the black shapes. We stared up at them, trying to make out where their eyes could be. One raised her hand, gloved in black, and shrieked, "They have hands!" We pulled faces at her. We were truly awful, but what we were seeing was so alien, so sinister, that we were trying to tame it, make it less awful. And what these Saudi women saw, of course, was little black kids acting like baboons. After 2 or 3 days, 2 men of the Osman Mahmoud clan arrived at the house with word from our father. He was in Ethiopia and might have to remain there for months. They asked my mother where she wanted to live while waiting for him to return. That night, Something inside her seemed to snap. She cried and cursed and hit at us in a kind of frenzy. She threw shoes at whoever opened his or her mouth. We were all scared of her now, even Mahad, her favorite. When the men came back the next day, my mother told them, Mecca. She must have felt that her life was going so wrong that if she clambered into Allah's embrace, he would make it better. Mecca, the home of the Prophet Muhammad, was the closest you could get to Allah. A week later, all our stuff was loaded into a car. We arrived at the foot of a tall building. Garbage was strewn all over the streets, heaps of rubbish covered in fat, buzzing flies. The stench in the stairwell was overpowering. The cockroaches were so contented, they didn't even bother to scuttle away. Father had sent money to these guardians of ours to rent a flat, but Mecca was expensive. The only place they could find for us was a small apartment in a building being occupied by Egyptian construction workers. We had never been inside an apartment building before. As we climbed the stairwell, Ma told Hawiya and me, if you come out here on your own, the men who live behind these doors on the stairs will snatch you up and cut you into pieces and eat you. That was effective. Never once did we venture outdoors alone. She opened a door onto a 2-room apartment. We were going to have electricity. There were switches on the wall that turned on light bulbs and something we had never seen, a ceiling fan. When Ma's back was turned, we began playing with the fan. We threw clothes and small objects at it just to watch them whirl. The fan broke. That first week, the apartment was like a charcoal oven. We were so hot that Hawiya's back broke out in fat little blisters, and for a week she was one big painful, never-ending scream. The uncles had already paid 5 months' rent up front. There was nothing to be done about the flat. All they could do was take us to the bazaar to buy essentials. Here we were, too transfixed to misbehave. There were lights and glitter and toys everywhere, and stalls pungent with blood and spices, the cackle of animals, and the plump promises of pastries. We had rarely been to a Somali market, and this huge array of stalls and shops was the most glorious thing we had ever seen. The uncles held our hands very firmly as we walked through this magical place and bought mattresses, bed sheets, pillows, a small fan. The next day, we returned for some food, prayer mats, cutlery, cooking pots, a metal basin for washing clothes, a scrubbing brush, hard soap, and a pail. Then our mother was alone with us, virtually the first time this had ever happened. With our grandmother staying behind in Somalia, my mother had nobody with whom to share the tasks and plans. She could do nothing on her own. She wasn't supposed to go out in the street without these new guardians of ours, our uncles, and neither were we. To phone them, she had to scuttle down to the corner grocer with my 10-year-old brother in tow, acting as her protective male. All day long we would wait in the apartment for the uncles to do us favors, and all day long my mother cursed our father. May Allah never bring him back, I remember her shouting. May Allah make him barren. May he get a painful disease. May he never see paradise. Worst of all, may Afwang catch him and torture him. May he be cut off from the bloodline and die alone. Realistically, we could do nothing but wait. Mother said about reestablishing discipline in our household. We children had grown wild in the months she had left us alone with our grandma. Ma saw us pretty much as camels. To tame us, she yelled and hit a lot. If we ran around, she yelled, "Sit, sit," and we would shrink to the floor. Then she would flick us with the radio cable on our legs and arms. When we cried, she would yell, "Quiet," and hit us again. This wasn't pleasant, but the hitting was not wanton, and though it hurt, it was controlled. To my mother, corporal punishment was a reasonable and necessary part of bringing up a child. In those days, as we learned to behave better, she hit us less. When the mosques in Mecca cried for prayer, they created a kind of synchronized chain we heard every day. First our neighborhood mosque, and then the next one, and the next, calling across the whole city and the country and the world. We developed a game of rushing from one window to another, testing who could remember best which direction the next call would come from. In Somalia, we had been Muslims, but our Islam was diluted, relaxed about regular praying, mixed up with more ancient beliefs. Now, our mother began insisting that we pray when the mosques called, 5 times each day. Before every prayer, we had to wash and robe ourselves, and then we had to line up and follow her instruction. After the evening prayer, we had to go to bed. My mother also enrolled us in a local Quran school. Although we spoke practically no Arabic, in Somalia, both school and the Quran school had been mixed, boys and girls. Here everything was segregated. Mahad had to go to a madrasa for boys, and Hawiya and I to one for girls. All the girls at madrasa were white. I thought of them as white, and myself, for the first time, as black. They called Hawiya and I Abid, which meant slaves. Being called a slave, the racial prejudice this term conveyed, was a big part of what I hated in Saudi Arabia. The teacher didn't teach us to write, just recite it to us from the Quran. We had to learn it verse by verse by heart.